Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our fall series of talks at the Center for European and Russian Studies at the University of California at Los Angeles. As many of you know already, we periodically offer talks on themes of public and scholarly interest, and this year we're working through Zoom and broadcasting on Facebook. Our talks are also posted for viewing on our website after the events. My name is Laurie Hart, and I'm Professor of Anthropology and Global Studies and Director of the Center. I want to begin by thanking our co-sponsors for the talk today, the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies, ELTS, at UCLA, which of course includes Italian studies in its portfolio, and the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, the Italian Cultural Institute at Los Angeles, whom we hope to welcome as partners for several talks in the course of the year. So thank you to those audiences for joining us. I'm pleased to introduce to you Brian J. Griffith, who is the inaugural Eugen and Jacqueline Weber postdoctoral scholar in European history at the University of California. He has, by the way, just arrived in LA, so we're happy to be his unfortunately remote public welcoming committee. Dr. Griffiths is a historian of modern Europe, with interests in modern Europe, modern Italy, fascism, consumerism, transnational identities, and the digital humanities. He earned his BA in history from Sonoma State University, his MA in modern European cultural and intellectual history from San Francisco State University, and his PhD from the University of California at Santa Barbara. He's been the recipient of many fellowships and awards recognizing both his teaching and his scholarship, including the Rome Prize Postdoctoral Fellowship in Modern Italian Studies from the American Academy in Rome, which he declined to come to UCLA, and a Fulbright Fellowship. Dr. Griffiths is at work on two book projects, one of which you'll hear about today, the other one on Italian volunteers to the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War. He's the author of several scholarly articles, including Bacchus Among the Black Shirts, Winemaking, Consumerism, and Identity in Fascist Italy, 1919 to 1937, in Contemporary European History, that's just out in November 2020, and Blogging in the Classroom, using a blog as a supplemental resource in Perspectives on History, the news magazine of the American Historical Association. That was a co-authored publication. He's also co-editor of the edited volume Food Fights, The Politics of Provisions in Global Perspective in Zapruder World, an international journal for the history of social conflict. He's also a very dynamic teacher and public intellectual, and I recommend that you all check out his impressively lively, relevant, and informative blog. You can access this also through the link to his website on our announcement, with compelling essays on timely topics such as how to keep the lights on in democracies. He's an editorial board member for the New Fascism Syllabus, which is a crowdsourced collection of writings on the history of fascist, populist, and authoritarian movements and governments during the 20th and 21st centuries, and the website coordinator for the Society for Italian Historical Studies. We'll be taking questions after the talk via the Q&A function, so please write your questions and I will relay them to the speaker. So with that brief introduction, I'll turn the podium over to Dr. Griffiths for contesting the national beverage, wine, beer, and the battle over foreign tastes and habits in interwar Italy. Brian.
Thank you so much, Laurie, and also Sanya and Liana at the Center for European and Russian Studies at UCLA for inviting me to give this talk and for hosting it today. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity. Quote, "There is undoubtedly a wine problem in Italy," lamented Arturo Mariscalchi, Fascist Italy's most outspoken and influential industrial wine lobbyist. Quote, "There are still 500 million men who do not know wine," he continued, "and most of them, when they are presented with this beverage in an informative and appealing manner, quote, would become new customers of the precious vine," end quote. "It's our fault," Mariscalchi regretfully informed his colleagues, adding that the country's luxury wine growers had largely failed to vigorously promote domestically produced wines among Italian consumers with, quote, "perseverance and technique." If Italy's pro-wine lobbyists hoped to defend the country's enological heritages from the so-called invasion of foreign tastes and habits, they needed to coordinate themselves and quickly. Quote, a work of this kind must also be carried out to counter the effects of anti-wine mania, Mariscalchi insisted, concluding, quote, propaganda must oppose propaganda, end quote. The pro-wine lobby's efforts at increasing domestic consumption of Italy's so-called typical wines, or vini tipici, during the 1920s, however, were obstructed by a variety of political and commercial challenges during fascism's first decade in power, including competition with other beverage industries, such as mineral water, coffee and cocktails, and above all, beer. Stemming from a series of financial losses during both the regime's Battle for Grain initiative and shortly thereafter, the Great Depression, by the late 1920s, the Italian brewing industry had largely begun to descend into a full-scale commercial crisis. In response, Italian brewers' commercial lobbying organization, the National Beer Propaganda Consortium, launched two ambitious collective marketing campaigns between 1929 and 1931, which were aimed at expanding domestic beer consumption beyond just the summer months, and equally as significant, tying the beverage's responsible consumption to notions of Italian identity and bourgeois domesticity. Italian brewers' wide-ranging marketing campaigns, of course, deeply vexed Italy's wine growers. Unwilling to yield any commercial ground to Italian brewers, the industrial wine lobby launched a coordinated series of collective marketing campaigns of its own in order to defend the quote-unquote world's vineyard from the invasion of quote-unquote semi-barbarian beverages, as one wine lobbyist colorfully phrased it in 1935. Wine lobbyists' concerns were shared by many others in Mussolini's Italy. Quote, during the liberal period, Ruth Ben-Ghiat writes, Italian consumption of foreign culture, both popular and elite, was among the highest in Europe. In addition to centuries of foreign occupation and political fragmentation, Italy's so-called mutilated victory at the Versailles Conference had only further strengthened the widespread conviction that, in the words of one contemporary observer, quote, everything foreigners do is great and everything we Italians do is awful. The fascists won followers, Ben-Ghiat continues, by promising to reverse the situation of foreigner worship and create a national culture that would be well received abroad, end quote. In carrying out these objectives, the dictatorship pursued an ambitious campaign for, quote, combating degeneration and radically renewing Italian society, end quote. However, the parameters of what constituted an adequately fascist or Italian idea, taste, and practice were, although subtly shaped and guided by the Duce's regime, largely left to the semi-autonomous spheres of intellectual, artistic, and as this paper will seek to demonstrate, commercial production. Thus, under Mussolini's 23 years in power in Italy, domestic brewers were able to legitimately compete with wine growers over the meanings as well as the limits of Italianness or Italianità in regard to the beverages that good fascist Italians were supposed to faithfully consume. Spurred by the threat of the brewers' marketing blitz during the early 1930s, Italy's luxury wine growers, merchants, and industrialists within the wine trade were launched into motion, highlighting beer's inherent foreignness to Italian tastes and habits, and promoting wine's deep historical roots within the Italian peninsula. By successfully tying wine growing to notions of Italy's historical patrimonies, promoting wine's contributions to fascism's physical education programs, and pursuing innovative methods for tying the winemaking industry's crisis of overproduction with the fates of various other agricultural sectors, above all the citrus fruit industry, Italy's industrial wine lobby not only recontextualized Italian viticulture as a national resource shared collectively by all Italians, they established the consumption of the peninsula's grapes and wines as a veritable national tradition. In 1924, Italy's peasant farmers experienced a considerably poor domestic wheat harvest, and as a result, retail prices for grain-based foods, above all breads and pastas, shot up by some 60%. In response, Italy's black-shirted prime minister at the time, Benito Mussolini, resolved to quote-unquote liberate Italy from what he believed were the quasi-colonial clutches of the great powers dominated international marketplace. Buoyed by this atmosphere of economic struggle and emboldened by the Duce's open declaration of dictatorship in January of 1925, the regime launched the battle for grain in order to, as Mussolini put it, unshackle, quote, the Italian people from slavery to foreign bread, end quote. In addition to placing considerably high tariffs on imported grains, the dictatorship offered a range of subsidies, including tax exemptions and financial assistance for machinery, fertilizers, and irrigation investments in order to stimulate a higher domestic wheat production. By 1935, domestic wheat production had increased by an impressive 40%, which of course significantly reduced the country's reliance on wheat imports. Now, while the regime was busy mobilizing its troops of contadini, peasant farmers, in the battle for grain, another crisis began looming on the horizon. During the course of 1925, the lira, Italy's currency, began a precipitous decline in its international exchange value. Quote, as the exchange rate fell to 155 against the British pound and 30.54 against the dollar, Spencer Di Scala explains, Mussolini feared that the lira's collapse would threaten the long-term stability of his fascist government. To combat this fiscal downward spiral, the dictatorship launched a parallel battle for the lira, which sought to stabilize the exchange value of the country's currency at quota 90, or 90 lira to the pound sterling. Deploying a combination of measures mobilizing public opinion, strengthening the central banking system, and institution credit restrictions, as well as, perhaps paradoxically, a hefty loan from New York City's Morgan Bank, by 1928, the dictatorship had succeeded in stabilizing the lira at an impressive 92.46 against the British pound. Now, the regime's battles, however, came with a number of unintended consequences for Italy's alcoholic beverage industries. The lira's revaluation at such a high rate, Di Scala points out, made Italian products expensive when international prices were already declining. To make matters worse, the Great Depression of 1929 through 33 struck before the effects of the revaluation of the lira had been completely absorbed by the Italian economy. As a result of these broader economic instabilities, Italy's wine growing industry entered into a full-blown agro-commercial crisis by the early 1930s. Stemming from a combination of mitigating factors, including the limited but significant successes of the Italian temperance movement's anti-wine propaganda campaigns of the early 1920s, the regime's battle for grain initiative, a precipitous decline in Italian wine exports to the United States following the passage of the 18th Amendment, and the economic shockwaves caused by the Great Depression, domestic consumption of Italy's grapes and wines was unable to keep pace with production. And consequently, Italy's grape producers began experiencing a crisis of overproduction. And while a significant quantity of the country's wines began piling up in the peninsula's wineries, warehouses, and commercial depots, Italian wine growers began inching towards a potentially disastrous financial precipice. Quote, the cause of this phenomenon, wrote one wine lobbyist, Luigi Capri-Cruciani, is, quote, easily explained by the contraction of consumption, end quote. Indeed, although wine consumption had remained more or less steady between 1910 and 1930, hovering at an annual average of approximately 112 liters per inhabitant, it began plunging dramatically to just 88.2 liters during the years immediately following the stock market crash. Quote, we are therefore already facing an annual loss in consumption of about 5 million hectoliters of wine, Capri-Cruciani worryingly exclaimed, which was reportedly equal to an income of about, quote, 500 million lire per year, end quote. Such potentially disastrous conditions, counseled Marescalchi, who as of 1929 had been appointed as the regime's undersecretary of the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, constituted a quote unquote national danger. Among wine lobbyists' highest priorities was the quote unquote battle against what many pro-wine campaigners and regime operatives frequently referred to as the deplorable snobbery of Italy's privileged classes. It was, quote unquote, no longer tolerable, declared Marescalchi, for Italians to be, quote, running after whims or passively following unhealthy and unnatural currents, such as serving the tea of British domains and enjoying, quote unquote, Teutonic beers. Doing so, he contended, only undermined the country's most important rural industry and consequently the domestic consumption of Italian wines. These wayward Italians, who were quote unquote worthy of the new times, Marescalchi continued, were in need of being thoroughly informed that it was their absolute duty to prefer national products, which are the quote, fruit of their land and come from the work of our people, end quote. In spite of the IWL's or the industrial wine lobby's anxieties with respect to beer's growing popularity among domestic consumers, however, Italian brewers were, by the late 1920s, beginning to experience a commercial crisis of their own. A combination of rising taxes on alcohol production and operation licenses and a considerable decline in domestic barley cultivation, due largely to the dictatorship's Battle for Grain initiative, had led to a significant decline in the consumption of Italian-made beers. Between 1930 and the following year, for instance, national beer production declined by 221,151 hectoliters, which, much like their winemaking colleagues, greatly perplexed Italian brewers. In response to these conditions, the members of the country's brewers began to organize themselves in order to address this collective commercial struggle for the industry. And on February 3rd, 1929, the members of the Consorzio Propaganda Birra Nazionale, or the National Beer Propaganda Consortium, which I've abbreviated as CPBN, which was composed of approximately 19 of Italy's largest brewers, voted in favor of pursuing an experimental form of collective advertising in the hopes of stimulating consumption of Italian-made beer in Italy. In its first report to the CPBN, Erwin, Wazy and Company, which I'm abbreviating as EW&C, and it was an influential New York City-based advertising agency, which had been hired by the Consorzio to carry out this ambitious campaign, hailed the forthcoming marketing blitz as a, quote, remarkable event in the reawakening of Italian advertising, which would deploy one of the most modern methods of advertising in today's times, and that was collective propaganda, end quote. So deploying the adopted slogan, Chi beve birra campa cent'anni, which translates to whoever drinks beer lives to be 100, EW&C and its subsidiary marketing agency in Milan, ERWA, ERWA, carried out two large-scale marketing campaigns on behalf of Italy's brewing industry between 1929 and 1931. Unlike Italy's wine growers, however, Italian brewers were faced with the steep challenge of harmonizing beer consumption in Italy with the regime-propelled twin forces of tradition and modernity. Towards these ends, the agency developed a handful of promotional materials which sought to overturn what they believed were common misconceptions regarding beer's purported foreignness among specifically bourgeois Italian consumers by promoting the beverage's connections to and associations with Italy's many historical and cultural heritages. In one advertisement entitled Go Back to the Sources, for example, ERWA, the Milan subsidiary of the New York City advertising agency, reminded Italian consumers of beer's storied role as a tasty and nourishing thirst quencher for the populations of the Euphrates River Basin and Imperial Rome. Featuring three superimposed images of beer consumers in ancient Egypt, classical Rome, and 20th century bourgeois high society, the agency's Go Back to the Sources advertisement repositioned beer as historical and quintessentially Italian by suggesting an underlying connection between the popular beverage and the birth of these complex civilizations. In a related advertisement or series of advertisements, Italian beer was characterized as a modern equivalent of vino di grano, or wheat wine. Quote, the history of Rome's earliest epics tells of a fresh drink held in great honor by Rome's founders, the advertisement informed its readers. Continuing, quote, this was a barley-based beverage, the primitive form of beer, which the Romans inherited from the Egyptians, end quote. Such connections, ERWA's advertisement insisted, had survived up to the contemporary period. Quote, the wheat wine of the Romans is the beer of the Italians, exclaimed still another advertisement in the series, which is why consumers, whether at home or in the cafe, at a bar or at a restaurant, should quote unquote, always request Italian beer. Now, the majority of Erwa's marketing materials, however, were centered on upon impacting the consumption tastes and habits of Italy's bourgeois households. Due largely to the poor reputations of the country's osterie and bettole, or wine taverns and saloons, beer, much like wine during the previous decade, was considered by many middle-class consumers as a predominantly working class and largely male beverage. To reverse these common associations, the agency developed a wide range of propaganda materials designed not only to make beer the preferred beverage, as Erwa's end of campaign summary explained to the consortium's members, but more importantly, the quote, most habitually consumed beverage among families in Italy, end quote. Above all, the agency's pro-beer advertisements strongly appealed to bourgeois women's cosmopolitan sensibilities by rebranding the beverage as popular and stylish. One Erwa advertisement, for instance, aptly entitled, quote unquote, beer becomes fashionable, or la birra diventa di moda, strategically proclaimed that, quote, beer is becoming women's favorite drink, due largely to the beverage's growing popularity among women of high society, both at home and abroad. Accompanied by an image of two women in formal evening attire and enjoying a few glasses of cold, refreshing beer, the advertisement concluded by exhorting its readers to, quote, follow fashion and always drink the most hygienic of beverages, end quote. Now, in the agency's end of campaign report in January 1931, Erwa explained that it had, quote, abstained completely from carrying out any attack on other Italian products during the advertising campaigns in support of Italian-made beer, quote unquote, above all, wine. In contrast to misleading public statements being made by many of Italy's luxury winemakers, the agency's report explained that the two industries shared a number of important commercial challenges in common. Any suggestion that the two industries occupied hostile as opposed to mutually reinforcing commercial territories was nothing more than a, quote, polemical artifice and an excess of zeal on the part of the friends of the wine industry, end quote. We therefore believe, the campaign summary continued, quote, that the ostensible beer-wine contrast was created for the sole purpose of awakening the wine producers from their advertising stupor and encouraging them to imitate brewers' example of intra-industrial solidarity, and finally, put up a valid defense for Italian wine's painful losses on many domestic and foreign markets, end quote. And if this is the case, the report's authors concluded, quote, there is nothing to do but to rejoice and ascribe the recent positive results for the beer campaigns as among the advantages brought to Italy by this collective campaign made by the brewing industry, end quote. As was indicated in Erwa's end of campaign report, Italian brewers' advertising campaigns struck a major nerve among Italy's industrial wine growers. For some time now, lamented Attilio Terenzio in December of 1929, just as EW&C was launching the first of the two pro-beer collective marketing campaigns, quote, there have been certain calls and invitations to drink beer, to consume beer, to quench one's thirst with beer, and even to feed on beer, end quote. Since calls for increased consumption within a limited sector of the market, quote, almost always represent the decline of another form of consumption, he added, any success in the Italian brewing industry enjoyed in doubling or even tripling the consumption of beer in Italy would come with the, quote, logical consequence of a reduction in the consumption of wine in Italy, end quote. The only question that remained, Terenzio concluded, was, quote, will the brewers succeed in their aim, end quote. While some called, somewhat foolishly, for Italians to boycott beer in the interest of achieving a, quote, complete restoration of national viticulture, others attempted to undermine the CPBN's marketing campaigns by way of leveraging the wine growing industry's comparatively stronger influence over the affairs of Fascist Italy's Senate. In December of 1929, for instance, Senator Tito Poggi, a Tuscan agronomist and the former director of the Giornale Vinicolo Italiano, or the Italian winemaking newspaper, publicly inquired whether or not the regime had the power or even the will to curb the very active propaganda that, even with hygienic pretexts, he explained, is now being carried out to spread the use of beer in our eminently viticultural country. To the utter chagrin of Poggi, as well as many other wine lobbyists, however, the fascist government's reply was unequivocal. Quote, "There is only one and very valid means available," the Wine Trade, a popular Italian winemaking newspaper, recounted to its readership, and quote, "That is to imitate the brewers and counterbalance an intense propaganda highlighting the merits of the moderate use of wine among our people who have known and been accustomed to it for millennia," end quote. Noting the urgency of informing Italians of the quote-unquote national duty of enhancing the vineyard, Capri Cruciani proudly announced the formation of the Associazione Vitivinicola d'Enotria, or the Vitiviniculture Association of Enotria, shortened as the AVE, which in his words would help consolidate wine growers' collective financial resources, disseminate news on the importance of vitiviniculture in Italy from an economic and a social point of view, and in general, quote, "create a sphere of lively sympathy around viticulture and vinous products in Italy," end quote. Armed with the AVE, Italy's wine lobbyists dedicated themselves to, quote, "fight an absolutely, frankly, fascistically national fight," as Luciano Pasquale phrased it in March 1930, and quote, "at the same time, they will realize their own interests, not separate from those of the economy of the nation, but common to it," end quote. In responding to Eroa's history-themed marketing materials, wine lobbyists went to great lengths to illuminate the wine growing industry's myriad contributions to Italian history, which purportedly, according to wine lobbyists, stretched from the classical to the industrial epochs. Unlike beer, which purportedly did not, quote, "speak as wine does with the voice of history, of traditions, of the country, of familial intimacy," end quote. Members of the IWL frequently proclaimed that winemaking had served as an unbroken agricultural practice in the Italian peninsula between the ancient and modern periods. While the Roman legions marched with the, quote, "symbol of the fasciolitorio," wrote Marescalchi, subtly drawing upon fascism's mytho-political rhetoric and imagery, the, quote, "centurion always carried the vine stock, which was planted in the region where the eagle of Rome had arrived," end quote. Although won by warfare, he subtly suggested, the emperor's conquests, much like those expected from Mussolini's forthcoming imperial conquests, had always been, quote, "rooted with the vineyard," end quote. More recently, however, Italian viticulture and wine consumption had played a substantial role within the Risorgimento, Italy's period of political unification between the mid to late 19th century. In addition to aspiring some of the young nation state's leading political figures, such as Giuseppe Mazzini, wine had served as a source of inspiration or a spiritual companion to some of post-unification Italy's most celebrated literary, intellectual, and artistic luminaries, including Giosuè Carducci, Giuseppe Verdi, Giovanni Pascoli, and Gabriele D'Annunzio, among many others. Beyond promoting wine growing's long and deeply rooted history in Italy, wine lobbyists attempt to intertwine their industry's marketing schemes with the ideological vocabulary and key objectives of fascism's popular sports programs. Responding to the regime's emphasis on health, virility, and physical prowess, Italy's wine lobby launched a handful of promotional campaigns which promoted wine as the ideal sportsman's beverage. The pernicious popular belief that, quote, "athletes have an advantage with wine abstinence," wrote Marescalchi in 1934, is a very big mistake, since the consumption of vino in small quantities is excellent for physical education, especially for, quote, "open-air games," and equally as significant, held the potential of improving one's physical performance by as much as 12 to 29%. Such efforts at undermining the CPBN's health and nutrition-oriented marketing materials were aptly depicted in a 1931 fumetto, which playfully skewed the intended meaning of the Consortio's widely disseminated marketing slogan, "Whoever drinks beer lives to be 100. Featuring an obese, effete, bourgeois beer drinker and a muscular, virile wine consumer, the cartoon humorously declared that whoever drinks beer is obese by 40 years of age, while whoever drinks wine lives longer and at 100 is able to stop a bull. Now, beyond combating the CPBN's collective marketing initiatives, the IWL sought to address the country's ongoing wine crisis by searching for new, innovative methods for redirecting Italy's excess grapes and wines towards alternative commodities and consumer markets. In addition to promoting Italy's luxury wines, explained the influential Venetian enologist Alfredo Mazzei, there was still a dire need for, quote, preparing a summer drink, and especially one that could compete with the popularity of foreign beverages, above all beer. Quote, whether the bevanda estiva, or the summer drink, is prepared with freshly crushed grape juice or with wine, Mazzei contended, such a beverage would be very, very much improved in its organoleptic, hygienic, and thirst-quenching qualities, quote, by adding a good dose of citrus juice, such as from oranges or lemons. By developing and helping to popularize such a bevanda estiva, Mazzei concluded, wine lobbyists could resolve or at least alleviate the two crises that are afflicting Italian agriculture. And that, of course, is the wine crisis and the citrus crisis. Now, many other pro-wine campaigners shared Mazzei's proposed summer beverage initiative. Quote, the people have their needs, their desires, their whims, which are what they are, end quote. Tommaso Jacqueline Monaco reasoned in The Wine Trade. While the consumption of pure, simple wine continually decreases among Italian consumers, he explained, the consumption of cocktails and beer is always increasing. Since Italian consumers did not appear prepared to begin consuming the peninsula's typical wines, or vini tipici, with a sense of urgency and national duty hoped for by Italy's industrial wine lobbyists, any success in combating the wine crisis, quote, depends upon the creative genius of the artisans, by which he meant luxury wine growers, experimental enologists, and wine merchants. The economic significance of the vitiviniculture and citrus fruit industries, Jacqueline Monaco explained, could not be emphasized enough. While wine accounted for some 5 billion lire in annual profits, for example, lemons and oranges produced approximately 484 and 462 million lire per year, respectively. Thus, the development of a national beverage would serve as a useful tool in appealing to and manipulating the snobbish preferences of bourgeois consumers, thereby, quote, replacing the charm of the foreign land with the beauty of our nature, end quote. Praising what he predicted would be the unitary beverage of the corporatist state, Jacqueline Monaco hoped that this new Italic drink, as he referred to it, would, quote, attract the Italian people to domestic wonders, as well as convince them of the foolishness of the siren calls of the barbarian, end quote. By the early summer of 1933, the National Farmers Confederation, in partnership with members of the IWL, had managed to bring some 22 different types of wine and citrus-infused beverages to the Italian marketplace, reportedly with some considerable successes. Among these experimental beverages was the quote-unquote thirst-quenching sparkling drink known as vin birra, or wine beer, which was reportedly manufactured with wine and citrus juice blended with herbal juices. Created by the Pier Guidi Beverages Company in Genoa, vin birra aimed to, quote, alleviate the crisis of these products by promoting their widest use and, equally as significant, encourage Italians to substitute exotic beverages, which above all included the growing popularity of Italian and foreign beers, with the, quote, healthy products of our agriculture, end quote. To promote the blended beverage, the Pier Guidi company hosted a sampling bar at the 1932 Fiera di Verona, or the Verona Trade Fair. In addition to offering samples of the Fiera's regular attendees, the company proudly served the minister and undersecretary of the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry with a handful of sample glasses of this experimental beverage. Acknowledging vin birra's wide support in Verona, as they phrased it, the two officials reportedly offered their strong words of encouragement to the Pier Guidi company's contributions to the invention and the popularization of a national beverage in fascist Italy. All right, so what can we say by way of conclusion here? During the 1920s, domestic consumption of Italian-made beers and wines declined significantly, due largely to the economic shocks which followed in the wake of the fascist dictatorship's battles for grain and the lira, and also, of course, the Great Depression. In response, Italian brewers attempted to stem these commercial losses and even gain new ground within the Italian alcoholic beverages consumer marketplace by launching an ambitious peninsula-wide collective marketing campaign on behalf of all Italian brewers. In addition to promoting beer's alleged historical roots in Italy, stretching from ancient Egypt to ancient Rome, the CPBN's advertisements targeted bourgeois consumers specifically, hoping to infiltrate the privacy of the middle-class home and transform bourgeois Italian men and women into loyal consumers of Italian-made beers. Now, such ambitions, as we've seen, deeply disturbed Italy's luxury wine growers and their commercial and industrial partners. In response to Italian brewers' promotional campaigns, the country's industrial wine lobby, or the IWL, led by the newly minted Vitiviniculture Association of Inotria, launched a series of collective marketing campaigns of their own, seeking to repudiate the CPBN's attempts at tying beer consumption to Italian identity and bourgeois domesticity, and more significantly, fortify wine's position as what was, to their minds, the country's quote-unquote national beverage. In addition to promoting the long and deeply rooted history of wine growing within the peninsula, wine lobbyists sought to intertwine their industry's marketing schemes with the ideological vocabulary and key objectives of fascism's popular sports programs, demonstrating wine's synonymity with fascist notions of virility and physical prowess. Moreover, and very much unlike Italian brewers, the IWL successfully partnered with other domestic agricultural industries who, much like beer and wine, were experiencing crises of overproduction. In partially tying Italian vitiviniculture's commercial fate to those of other national industries, such as the citrus fruit producers of the economically underdeveloped Italian South, the wine growing industry successfully navigated through and even helped to shape the priorities and anxieties of Mussolini's 20-year dictatorship. And in so doing, as I have argued here, they established Italy's grapes and wines as national resources and their consumption as a national tradition. Thank you so much.
To unmute myself. Thank you very much, Brian. I will now welcome questions from the participants. You can post your questions in the Q&A for discussion, which I have up on my screen. And I'll relay them to Brian. So, but maybe I could start off with a question here. I find it really fascinating the way in which you describe this sort of publicity battle between beer and wine. And I have several questions specifically about the advertising campaign, but let me start off with a much more general question, which is that from the account that you've presented, the campaign of the vintners is conducted through an appeal to values which you might associate with fascism and certainly with nationalism. But the fascist political machine, let's say, did not intervene directly to promote this industry over beer, from what I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so I'm curious about a couple of different things. Was there a sense in which the political establishment, in fact, was more interventionist than is at first apparent? And then secondly, are there actual personnel connections that are stronger between, say, the beer industry and fascist, the fascist government, or wine and the fascist government? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for those two very, very good questions. Actually, you've kind of hit at the heart of this particular phase of this research project, which has a lot to do with the connections between industry and regime, right? And what surprised me a great deal in preparing this talk, which of course is a kind of seed for a future publication, is realizing how agnostic the fascist regime was in regard to the existence of the Italian beer industry, right? Because it does seem at face value that beer is, foreign to Italian culture. That's what's surprising, I think, about this research to me. And that was certainly one of the talking points of the Italian winemaking industry. But what mattered most to Mussolini's regime was in terms of economics, was the national economy. And what that constituted was not heritage products per se, which is what the winemakers wanted to contend, but rather all the components of the national economy. Any economic activity that was nationally Italian, run by Italians, regardless apparently of the dependency upon foreign imports for things like barley and hops, which the brewers were dependent upon. What mattered the most is that they were an economic sector and therefore mattered to the national economy. And the space that the regime gave to the contest over what Italianità actually meant, what it actually stood for in terms of beverages, in terms of foods, was largely left up to these industries to kind of, duke it out over their marketing battles. And that was deeply frustrating to the winemaking industry, who very much wanted this exclusive relationship with the regime. Now, to the second part of your question, which is a really important thing that you pointed out, the winemaking industry was just much vaster than the much larger than the Italian brewing industry. If you look at the consumption figures, the beer consumption even now doesn't even come close to wine consumption. So there's almost this like crisis of authority at work and this panic over the rising rates of beer consumption among the winemakers. Going, for example, from like 1% to 3% in a decade versus something much higher for wine. But the winemaking industry, due to its size and its connection to not only the agrarian sector of the Italian economy, but also industry, heavy industry, because the manufacturers of mechanical pumps, of chemical pesticides, all of them were tied into viticulture, very much unlike the brewing industry, which I mentioned before, was deeply dependent upon various foreign industries like hops producers and grain and barley producers. And so because of that enormous economic footprint, right, in Italy, winemaking did enjoy a disproportionate influence within the regime. But it's interesting to me that was not a monopolistic relationship as much as the industrial wine lobby would have liked it to be.
Thank you. I have a question from our audience. This question is, I'll just read it. From what you know of other products in the same period, do you think that this exploration of consumer culture under fascism modifies general views of the regime, such as its identification with the aestheticization of politics? Should we begin to take more seriously the combined aestheticization of consumer products via modernist avant-garde aesthetics, as shown by Karen Pincus's Bodily Regimes study of advertising, and politicization of economics as the underbelly of the regime and the corporate state?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's something that I've been kind of toiling on and grappling with for the last year or two, thinking a bit more sort of larger picture here about what the implications of not only these marketing campaigns, but the larger project on winemaking that I'm currently engaged in writing, what that means for our understanding of the nature of fascism and what the regime was and stood for. And also who are the kind of agents, the political agents behind the formation of what we refer to as fascist culture and modernity. And so the short of my answer here is that I have more thinking to do here, but this is definitely the direction that I'm taking this research, which is to relate it to the broader research in historiography on, as Claudio mentioned, the aestheticization of politics in fascist Italy. To put it more plainly, the commercial underbelly of these larger political phenomena that historians for the past 20, 30 years of fascist Italy have been working on. So I'm working to relate my research to that body of research.
Thank you. And as Brian mentioned, that was from Claudio Fogger. A comment and a question from Robert English. The lira's plummeting value was a monetary, not fiscal crisis. The
Yes.
fiscal refers to tax and interest rate policy, not the exchange rate. So that's a comment on the lira.
Indeed. Thank you for the correction.
Okay. And the question, the leading Italian brewers, Peroni, Moretti, Menabrea, etc., all date back to the mid-19th century. What's more, in the 1930s, Italy exported roughly as much beer as it imported, according to ISTAT and the Banca d'Italia. How is this then an imported beverage?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, so I actually did this research at the l'Archivio Storico di Birre Peroni in Rome. So they have a large historical archive that's open to researchers. It's magnificent if anyone who is listening is interested in these topics. Very well organized, and that's where I found all these collective marketing campaigns. So yes, Peroni is one of the major ones involved. Moretti, Menabrea, also Paskowski's, which is no longer in existence, was also included in this list of 19 brewers. Now, I should say that the consortium didn't include every single Italian brewer. It was just the major producers in Italy. So from the perspective of the industrial wine lobby, right, part of their marketing ploy to undermine Italian beer and to kind of counteract the effects or the intended effects of the collective marketing campaigns on behalf of Italian brewers was to point out the fact how dependent the Italian brewing industry was on foreign imports, because as I mentioned before, prior to the battle for grain, there were more domestic barley supplies available, but the battle for grain expanded wheat production in Italy, which displaced some of the crops that Italian brewers were able to previously draw upon, which made them more dependent upon foreign sources of the basic ingredients which go into making beer. Now, something that didn't make it into this presentation, just due to time constraints, was that in 1934, when Mussolini unveils officially the corporatist regime and announces the different corporate branches of the Italian economy, vitiviniculture gets its own corporation. But the regime puts brewers in that corporation, which is, of course, insulting to the industrial wine lobby, but turns out to actually be to their great advantage, because what the purpose of the of corporatism and the corporate branches of the Italian economy under fascism was to regulate the production, distribution, and consumption cycles of entire sectors of the Italian economy. And now that brewers were included in that branch of the Italian economy under an IWL dominated branch of the Italian economy in the Vitiviniculture Corporation, winemakers, industrial winemakers, were able to basically mandate, to the disadvantage of the Italian brewing industry, that they needed to nationalize their resources as much as they possibly could. And part of that went into partnering with farmers to grow the necessary ingredients, but also mandating the brewers had to have a certain percentage of nationally grown sources of malt, nationally grown hops, which were very hard to find in Italy. And so that pushed the industry further away from dependence on the materials for making beer. Now, as far as beer imports go, I haven't focused on those because, of course, they were not the participants within this collective marketing campaign. Those were the Italian companies that participated in the campaign, not foreign manufacturers.
Thank you. A question from Julie Powell. Propaganda seems largely aimed at the middle classes, I presume to some extent in an effort to capture disposable income. Did the wine lobby just cede territory to beer brewers in the working class market, or did they make an effort to grow or maintain that customer base as well? And if so, how did they shape their appeal?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I will begin by saying I have just recently, as Laurie pointed out in my introduction earlier, I've just recently published an article in Contemporary European History, which is specifically on this topic. So it didn't make it into the presentation, unfortunately. I focused on different topics. But for anyone who's interested in seeing kind of an overview of the IWL's attempts at shaping the perception of wine and the consumption of wine among specifically bourgeois Italian consumers, I would direct you to that article. As I mentioned, it's open access, so it can be accessed by anyone. But yes, so the wine, as a result, I'll kind of speedily go through this. Wine during the opening decade of the 20th century and also during the First World War, wine became closely associated with working class squalor, at least among Italian politicians, intellectuals, and more broadly the middle classes, for a variety of reasons. Perhaps the largest one was that during the First World War, Italy's war industries, which was subsidized by the inter-allied credit loans that were given to Italy by Great Britain and the United States, enabled a higher employment rate among the industrial working classes, particularly in the north. And they had more disposable incomes and therefore were able to buy things that they normally weren't able to buy. And this kind of unfolds into an association that wine came to be associated with images of industrial working class squalor and working men's saloon culture. And so because of that, and then immediately after the war, there's an Italian temperance movement propaganda campaign aimed at alcohol in general, but they attack wine in particular because wine is the most widely consumed alcoholic beverage in Italy at that point, and particularly among the working classes who are suffering from higher than the normal rates of chronic alcoholism. And so the temperance movement also comes into the picture and further kind of sullies wine's image among the middle classes. And so the entire 1920s and 30s were really dedicated to, through a variety, like just a wide range of initiatives to kind of turning around that image and to convince middle class Italians, right? And this was connected to the regime's broader project of convincing Italians that they weren't like they had a culture in which with which they could be proud of, right? Like that they didn't need to foreigner worship anymore and consume foreign trends to be fashionable or to be accepted in the world, but that Italy had its own national prestigious culture that they could draw upon liberally. And from the winemaker's perspective, that included Italian-made wines. So yes, that was a major portion of the IWL's marketing campaigns, but as I mentioned, unfortunately didn't make it into today's presentation.
Thank you. One more comment from Robert English. Well, for that matter, thanks to phylloxera, many Italian vines were grafted onto American rootstock that is just as imported as the brewer's barley. Italian brewers should have seized on this.
That is indeed true, yeah. Yeah, and for those who don't know, the phylloxera is this this little root louse that that was actually a custom. It had evolved in North America to North American grapevines, and those were largely immune from the phylloxera. That the two had evolved over time together. But in the late 19th century, as steamship travel became more prevalent between the two parts of the world, graftings and clippings began to kind of make their way around the different viticultural regions of the planet, and that brought the phylloxera to Europe, which absolutely devastated French, Spain, and to a lesser extent Italian vineyards. And they tried so many different things to correct this, but ultimately, as Robert rightly points out, the solution was really to basically uproot entire vineyards, to plant American rootstocks, which were resistant to the phylloxera, and then to graft Italian and French varietals onto those rootstocks. So that's indeed true.
That's a good point. We're almost out of time. I just wanted to ask you one last question about another aspect of the presentation. We've been talking a lot about wine and beer, but another aspect of the relationship that you have sketched out between fascism and the industries has to do with advertising itself. And it seems as though there is an aspect of this response from the regime of encouraging advertising to actually develop. And I don't know if you've seen the interesting documentary by Adam Curtis, The Century of the Self, which traces some of the psychoanalytic and public relations, the development of that industry in relationship to politics in the US over this period of time. I'm just wondering if you could say something more about advertising itself, this new collective advertising system, and how fascism is related to the development of that.
Yeah, Laura, that is such a good question, because that's for the second time today, you've anticipated another deep kind of current of my the direction I'm taking this research in. I'll put it as succinctly as possible. the aim that I have here is somewhat of a historiographical, subversive one. I would like to look at, I mean, we tend to think of propaganda as something that, that like authoritarian regimes do, right? And then advertising is a thing that you do to sell more products. And those are separate in their aims and their methods. And the kind of psychological principles and observations inherent within the book, those are separate areas of activity. And I actually don't see that divide as starkly as some people do, which is why I've allowed the word propaganda to kind of intermingle in my research with advertising. And so I'm very much interested in two things. I'm interested in what the differences between, or the similarities are between the Italian fascist regime's propaganda campaigns for making Italians and the winemaking industry's advertising or marketing campaigns for precisely the same thing, making Italians, and the relationship between the two of them, the industry, the winemaking industry, and the regime. I haven't exactly sorted all the ins and outs, the differences between these out just yet, but I suspect that there's a really intimate relationship going on here, and that the winemaking industry, given that behind grain production it's like the second largest industry in Italy during the 1920s and 30s, that there's a hugely unrecognized contribution made by winemaking propaganda to the regime's nationalization campaigns and schemes especially during the 30s. So that precisely that false dichotomy between marketing and advertising and propaganda is something that I'm really interested in exploring.
Thank you so much. It was really a fascinating domain. A final comment, and then we'll have to conclude. Again, from Robert English, I noticed some subtle images in your illustrations of the beer Italian historical tradition campaign in the background of the Egyptian, Roman, Italian scenes. In one ad is an apparently black jazz band. In the other family scene, one lady is holding a HARS cigarette. Looks like some subliminal advertising here as well.
Well, that would be on par for public relations to kind of fold in different industrial interests to another industry's marketing campaigns. But also, I think that might have a lot to do with the fact that the beer makers hired an American marketing firm, whereas the Italians, the winemakers, they rejected that and went on their own. So perhaps that's what we're seeing peeking through there. Good eye.
Another interesting dimension to explore, the international advertising connections versus the national ones. Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for a really engaging talk, and I hope that we'll be able to follow some more of your work in the future. We hope to have a lecture in the spring on your work on posters in the contemporary moment, fascist posters in Italy in the contemporary moment. Please I want to thank our audience for participating and contributing such wonderful questions. Please check our website for future events. And I would just indicate for those of you interested in products of one sort or another that we do have a talk in January about cross-Mediterranean traffic in animals and pandemics that might be of interest to many of you. So I want to thank you very much, and thank you especially to Brian for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.